Thank you, Leon. Thank you very much to our excellent, my fellow and co-vice chair, and our excellent speaker, Mohammed, or Amin as we know him. Thank you for that excellent talk. Amin, I wanted to ask you something about your preparation for the talk and the difference between what you knew already with all your many, many years of interest in and experience of this subject and related matters. What was, in the period of your preparing this talk, the most surprising thing, if there ever was one during this period, that you came across?
I'll be honest. Let me be honest. There was no new thing that I learned while preparing the talk, because I was using things that I already knew. I mean, I knew about the Naz Shah affair when it happened. I knew about the Jeremy Corbyn thing from a couple of years ago when it happened. I'd written about the IHRA definition in quite a lot of detail, originally for Conservative Home. There's an article which was first published on Conservative Home, and then an expanded version on my website about why I support the IHRA definition. And I've written a couple of articles starting from, I think, 2014, exploring about when anti-Zionism does not become anti-Semitism, which is when those diagrams date from, although I did obviously spend a bit of time tidying up the diagrams, improving them, focusing on this question about whether you can be whether any anti-Semites were pro-Israeli, for example. So there was quite a lot of polishing up and revising of that nature done to prepare the presentation, but it wasn't a case of going out and doing new original research and therefore learning something new.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much, Mohammed, and thank you all of you for organizing this space, which this is the first time I've made it. You've been holding this space brilliantly. It's so needed, and this subject is one reason that it's needed. I want just to introduce where I'm coming from. I'm an academic. I do work on anti-Semitism, and at the moment I'm helping Human Rights Watch to develop a program of activity on anti-Semitism. So I've had lots of opportunities to talk with folk, and one of the observations I've come up with is that there are very few spaces where people from different backgrounds can talk about Israel, Palestine rationally, passionately, with full trust, and one of the reasons that communications break down is we come from very different sensibilities according to how we see ourselves. So as Jews, Muslims, Christians, as secular people, French, British, Palestinian, Israeli, we hear each other through these different experiences, and that means we construct our definitions of what is anti-Semitism, what's barely anti-Semitic, what's really serious anti-Semitism, how that relates to Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism, how it relates to anti-Palestinian racism and other racism. And so I guess I'm just preparing to ask you the question, for us to be able to promote public discussions that work, that include the sensibilities of people who come from different perspectives, do we need to have shared understandings of anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim racism or Islamophobia? And how those things relate to racism in general and to Western civilization in general? I'd love to hear your thoughts on the challenges there.
Yes, certainly. You won't be surprised, given what I said earlier about the importance of definitions, but I think the reason why most of these conversations break down is, first of all, as you said, people get very emotional. They get so emotional that it impairs their ability to think. secondly, they talk without spending any time trying to define precisely what they're talking about. And definitions are at the heart of most of these arguments. And unless you have definitions, you're simply talking past each other. So, for example, you mentioned Human Rights Watch and I can't remember whether it was Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, but there was a report about apartheid. And as soon as you say the apartheid word, of course, people start to get very excited. People are very imprecise about whether they are talking about what happens inside the state of Israel or whether they are talking about what happens in the West Bank. And just to continue the point, in the West Bank, there are two separate systems of law, separate systems of policing, one that applies to Jewish settlers in the West Bank who are governed by Israeli civil law, exactly the same civil law that applies in Tel Aviv. And there is a separate system of military law applied for Palestinian residents of the West Bank, because the West Bank is actually occupied by the state of Israel as occupied territory. And even the state of Israel doesn't claim that the West Bank is Israeli territory. It doesn't claim that it's not, it's ambiguous. But unless you're clear whether you're talking about the state of what happens inside the state of Israel, inside the 1949 armistice line, or you're talking about what happens in the West Bank, to talk about apartheid without being clear about which of those two places you're talking about, you're going to have a dialogue of the deaf.
Couple of observations and a question. I mean, the one group of people who you missed out, who are the Zionists, who believe in the state of Israel and creating the state of Israel, but yet are very often anti-Semitic themselves, which are the people in the mostly American evangelic Christian churches who believe creating the state of Israel and allowing all the Jews to go back and live there is a prerequisite for the end of time.
Yeah, they are. I agree with you, by the way. Those people really do exist, and they are challenging to think about and to classify. Because, first of all, they very strongly believe in the existence of the state of Israel. They very strongly believe in the right and indeed the desirability of Jews moving to Israel. That's because they want the second coming to take place when the Jews will be sort of wiped out during the return of Jesus and the conflict that happens thereafter. And I have to confess, I left them out of these slides just because it was really problematical enough already. But I did have that question in red about whether they are. I mean, it's hard to say. I'm not convinced that those people are anti-Semitic. I mean, I don't believe that those American evangelical Christians have any personal hostility to Jews. I don't think they would do anything to discriminate against Jews in America or Jews in France or even Jews in Israel. They just want some peculiar theological things to happen.
Having spoken to some American Jews, my impression is that some of the people in this church, maybe not all of them, but a sizable number are actually very anti-Semitic.
I just don't have any data on that.
I don't have data. I can't prove it, but
sorry, Leon. Did you mean that to sound as though you were saying that, having spoken to American Jews, you are sharing their perception that some evangelical American Christians are anti-Semitic? It sounded like you were saying some of the American Jews were anti-Semitic. I just wanted to clarify.
No. I meant some of these American evangelical Christians.
Well, I would just like to, if I could just add one thing there. I think you are right on that, Leon, in one sense, that though Amin is right to say that some very peculiar theological viewpoints and conclusions can be reached, if the sum total of those is that you're wiping out Judaism, there is nothing more anti-Semitic than to say the end times will destroy Judaism. Oh, by the way, I'm not anti-Semitic. So I would think that's why those American Jews are correct. If they take such a peculiar view, and we're talking way to the right of any Billy Graham view, then that conclusion is anti-Semitic.
Yeah,
Weirdly, so,
I think it's even more on a more day-to-day practical level that they wouldn't hire Jews. They would try and avoid doing business with American Jews
Right.
on that level as well.
Well, if that's the case, then I would definitely classify them as anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
Actually, I really classify them as being pro-Israeli.
But well, they are and they aren't. But yes,
That's
it
right.
is a very, very weird way. I've had my own personal confrontation with some in this country when I used to volunteer at a Christian festival.
And of course, what does one make of Marjorie Taylor Greene, congressperson from Georgia, who talks about Jewish space lasers as responsible for Californian wildfire?
Well, I think she's batty, completely
Well,
batty.
yes. Well, let's not go into American politicians because there's a number of them who are quite batty.
Yeah, thankfully, only a few though.
I would also point out that I would disagree with your definition when you said anti-Zionism A and anti-Zionism B are necessarily actually anti-Zionists. They are Zionists, but maybe not in the same way, I think, as Netanyahu. Netanyahu certainly wants to actually redefine Zionism as a belief in what he believes. And not just in the state of it. Eretz Israel, by the way, is just the simple name for that whole area.
Yeah,
which is
what I
in
tried to
Palestine.
explain. Yeah.
It's just the Hebrew for it. And for those who don't know me, I should just point out that I am not only am I British and a member of the party and a former parliamentary candidate, I'm also an Israeli citizen, a Jewish, and I've served in the Israeli army. And in fact, even yesterday, I was at a demonstration in London against the actions of the current Netanyahu government.
Yeah, hi, and thanks very much for your presentation. Your sort of three levels of anti-Zionism, which I've not come across before, so that was quite helpful. I just wondered, sort of, in connection with that, obviously there are people in Israel who are quite left-leaning and see the status quo as being well, not necessarily acceptable, but it's kind of how things are, and opposing it to some extent. And then there's the very right-wing bunch, if you like, who seek to expand way beyond Eretz Israel, if you like, up into Syria, even Turkey. And I just wondered how that sort of expansionist thinking sat alongside your three levels of Zionism. Thank you.
These are three levels of anti-Zionism. I mean,
yeah, sorry, anti-Zionism.
And the reason, and while those three are not in any sense meant to be conclusive of the whole possible universe of different types of anti-Zionism, there's an enormous range of different kinds of anti-Israeli, anti-Zionist views that you could have, that a person could have. And I just picked three because I wanted one that was so very, very moderate, one that was much stronger, and one that was very strong, but all of them at least potentially capable of being real positions that real people would hold. And equally, in terms of what is Zionism, well, I went to the World Zionist Organization for a definition, which they have and publish. And again, very few people would consider Eretz Israel really included southern Turkey, for example. I mean, even at its height, the Davidic kingdom, I think, never actually reached quite that far, although I don't think we know exactly what the boundaries were, but I don't think they went that far. So a desire to annex sort of southern Turkey would be a sort of a very strong form of Zionism, and therefore opposition to that I would regard as a very gentle form of anti-Zionism.
Can I just point out that what Theodore Herzl said, he said in Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel. He didn't say all of the land of Israel, and there is no definition of what Eretz Israel includes. most people today would assume it means the area covered by the 1922 League of Nations mandate of Palestine.
Although,
which-
of course, there are plenty of people at the more extreme end of the Zionist movement who say that it was wrong when Britain took off a chunk of that and gave it to establish the Hashemite kingdom of
Oh,
Jordan.
absolutely, yes.
They shouldn't have done that.
Absolutely. And indeed, if you look at the symbol of Cherut, which is one of the parties which made up Likud, it still has in its emblem a map which includes all of Jordan as part of the land they claim, because some of that land was part of the land that was where the 12 tribes, the original 12 tribes of Israel existed. But I think most Israelis and most Zionists today would be very happy to include, to say we are only talking about the land between the river and the sea. And most Israelis would be happy indeed to withdraw to the 49 boundary, as long as they could be sure that they wouldn't have an enemy close by, within rocket distance of Tel Aviv. But I think that's not to do with anti-Semitism. I think the problem comes when people confuse Israel with Jews. And
Exactly, Leon, and if I may just sort of come back there, you know, as humans in the world, we have to be able to call out actions of Israel that are illegal for all kinds of reasons, without being called out for being anti-Semitic. You know, there is a very clear difference between criticizing Israel and criticizing Jewish people, and you can be a friend of Israel, and you could be a friend of anybody and criticize them. I think that should be understood and recognized and accepted.
That's right. If I can come back in on this, I mean, as I said, I think the IHRA definition is an excellent definition, in particular the way that it introduces its examples by making it clear that these examples always have to be looked at in context. Where it goes wrong, or where people go wrong, is when they latch on to the examples and say that if you violate any of these examples as we read them, then we think you're automatically an anti-Semite. And to take another sort of concrete example, somebody who's not on this, I didn't make him a case study, but Afzal Khan MP, who's actually a pal of mine personally, and is my local MP in Manchester Gorton constituency. He is a co-founder of the Muslim Jewish Forum of Greater Manchester. He's a great friend of the Jewish community in Manchester, gets on extremely well with the Jewish Rep Council, has done a lot for the community, and he regularly speaks on platforms about what's wrong with the conduct of the Israeli government, the occupation of the West Bank, etc. And because of that, he gets regularly accused by extreme pro-Zionists in Manchester of being anti-Semitic, when he's nothing of the sort, because they are failing to apply the IHRA definition because they're not taking into account any context whatsoever.
If they say your friend is anti-Semitic, then presumably they would be saying I'm anti-Semitic, because I spend a vast amount of my time complaining about the actions of the current Israeli government, both within the occupied territories and within Israel.
Could I add something to that very point that you're both making there?
Yeah.
I think the problem is that no other religious grouping, if we want to put this into the mix, because we are discussing more than anything territorial aspects of this and nation aspects, no other religious grouping has just one state in which they are anything like a majority. And I think, whereas if you criticize let's say Italy, I'm half Italian. Let's say Ireland, I'm partly Irish. You are just criticizing two amongst innumerable Catholic origin countries, of which obviously the population of many of those are not all Catholic. But because the government is not religious necessarily, even Ireland now, extremely secular, we would say that one cannot be in any way considered to be anti-Catholic if one says, like my father did, God bless him, for years and years and years, the Italian government's a shambles. But with Israel, it's very different. You can, obviously, Leon, as a liberal, be associated with a staunch anti the current and recent government of Israel without anybody, because you are first of all Jewish and secondly a liberal. Even if you weren't Jewish, everybody would think it's perfectly acceptable for a liberal-minded person towards the center left of that perspective to detest the Netanyahu government without in any way thinking you were an anti-Semite. However, unfortunately, because it's the only state where the majority of people are Jewish, and because we had as a human race the Holocaust, those two equate to, in my view, which is where I think Amin was very helpful with us looking at the IHRA definition, because they equate to some of the obsession that the far left, and it is only the far left, that they have with the examples that Amin was alluding to. Those obsessions they have with those examples do, in my view, very strongly, I feel, equate to a form of anti-Semitism. Because when you think about it, if you say the existence of a state of Israel, and that definition example is very clear to say, considering the state of Israel as being something that shouldn't exist, is anti-Semitic. Of course it's anti-Semitic, because what you're saying is one religion in the entire world, one ethnic grouping in the entire world is not entitled to, despite the worst, hideous, anti-human venture in history, the Holocaust, they're still not entitled to have a homeland of their own, where they are a majority people, where they don't have to look over their shoulder. Now, in my view, anybody in any part of the perspective politically who says the state of Israel shouldn't exist, I think it's a racist endeavor, Zionism equates to nationalism, blah, 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 all that nonsense. If they say that, in my view, that is an anti-Semitic statement. Because to believe Israeli Jews should not exist and that the Jewish people should not have a home, and had the Holocaust never happened, and even if we were in the era of Herzl or the aftermath of his demise, a great man in my view, even if we were in that period, it would still be an anti-Semitic thing, I think, to state that the only grouping in the world that are not, who must be destined forevermore to be nomadic, victimized, a minority, are the Jews. Every other religious grouping, all the others, have countries where they are a majority.
That's not
have a
quite true. That's not 100%.
Well, all right, maybe not the very, 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 very minuscule religions.
No,
you
but I mean,
Again,
you could look at the Kurdish.
Lorenzo, if I can respond to that, because I think, again, this is one of those cases where one needs to be really, really precise. So let me just,
Yes.
let me just screen share the presentation again. So this is the presentation, and I just want to go back to, yep. Anti-Zionism B and anti-Zionism C, because when somebody says the state of Israel should not exist, I think there, as I said earlier, there are multiple possible versions of anti-Zionism, but I would ask them some more questions to try to see exactly what they mean. Because if this person thinks that it's impossible to separate what Jews in the West Bank, and that Jews in the West Bank, literally simply will not move out, and that you can't have set up a Palestinian state in what's left of the West Bank, and that the only just solution is for everybody to stay there, but in a single binational state. That's one proposition. It's a different proposition to the proposition which says Jews moving into Palestine was so wrong that they need to be moved out, which is what the image was that Naz Shah shared in her Facebook post. So even with being sort of anti a state of Israel in terms of a Jewish state, you still need to ask them more questions to try to nail down exactly what this person is saying before trying to decide whether or not this person is being anti-Semitic or not.
I just want to come on the point that Lorenzo mentions when you were sort of like riffing and speculating on why the sort of the far left has this kind of like preoccupation with anti-Semitism as it is. Well, the way I've read it is like it comes from the history of what we consider old money and new money, basically like old landed estates and basically sort of people who make their money through banking and so forth. And basically, obviously, the old sort of conservative aristocracy kind of like obviously advocated, the old money because it's the stability and so forth, and so did many sort of religious courts and that. I found out like around my reading that it came around the time of when the Jews were expelled to parts of Renaissance Italy. Basically, the sort of classic definition, the classic sort of like stereotypes of anti-Semitism came in because they're excluded. Many Jews were excluded from farming, from the military, and various other castes, which meant there was many of them were driven into professions such as the law and financing and that kind of thing, which the Catholic Church didn't look kindly on, but still profited from anyway around there. But that came from the old sort of like started the old attitude to basically like, well, these people are grouping in here. What's going on here, kind of thing.
The thing was, money lending was one of the few professions open to Jews.
Well, yeah, so saying,
and it was forbidden to Christians.
Well, exactly, but
so therefore
but still good enough to tax though. The Catholic Church still taxed it, even though
And also, there's more than one occasion where the rulers who are in debt to Jews, to the Jewish population, who suddenly realised they could get out of all their debts if they expelled all the Jews.
Indeed,
absolutely.
What I was trying to say is that just linking into this, some of the reading I've been doing, one of the books I think you should put in the reading list, I think, that you put there, was the Jews Don't Count by David Baddiel.
Yeah, it's a good book. I've read it.
Yeah, which touches on many of the themes that you've put on, but different language. But he mentions as well, I mean, just touching on the point that Lorenzo mentioned, that he said that you have to remember as well that the way that anti-Semitism is practiced, it's not just a sort of like a religious persecution, it's a racial one too. Like with regards to the Holocaust, Hitler wasn't like asking people like how often they go to the Holocaust, go to the synagogues. Now people just shot out of hand for looking a certain way and being a certain way, and the anti-Semitism, mainstream follows that kind of thing, where people look a certain way and feel certain characteristics.
And if they had grandparents who were Jews,
indeed, yeah, they had a really weird hierarchy with it, because even like one of the wives of one of the SS officers had a tangential link to the Jews, and they had to kind of like go through his family tree, like, well, you're kind of okay. The thing about racism doesn't make sense. So the thing is that what David Baddiel argued in his book is that anti-Semitism is actually a form of racism, but the far left haven't got around to thinking that way, because they think that by definition Jews are white, and therefore they can't be racist. That anti-Semitism isn't a form of racism, so therefore don't have to worry about it, kind of thing. So they can't sort of square that mental circle. That it's their form of discrimination, which is still wrong, because if Jews are white, they can't be persecuted. They can't be in a form of trouble.
Anyway, George.
Zach, it's even stronger than that, because the people on the left associated with that line of thinking not only say because Jews are white, you can't be racist against them, but also because they see that Jews are wealthy and successful, and you can only be racist against people who are downtrodden.
Yeah, that's true.
Well,
George has his hand up.
Anyway, George.
I'll jump in. Thanks. Following on from the Jews Don't Count perspective, I think it's very valuable in a discussion of what anti-Semitism is to add to the reflections on what makes people have prejudicial thinking. So that's thinking about how someone gets in the space where they could think these things. Also, what's the impact on Jews? What's the intended impact on Jews? And so so this is a different space, which is important because you can do something against a vulnerable group or a vulnerable person without intending to. And in the case of anti-Semitism, it matters. Even if you have the right motivation for being liberal or anti-Zionist or socialist, whatever your or conservative, whatever your grand motivations are, what also matters is the experience that a Jewish person might have if they feel targeted. And so without saying, while building on everything that you've been saying, I think this is a completely different dimension that when it drops out, especially we very eloquent, intelligent people in political parties can easily forget that we may actually be right about something and still our targeting of someone, making them responsible for something which they're entirely not to blame for, that act can be anti-Semitic.
Well, it is one of the IHRA examples, because one possible type of anti-Semitic behavior holding Jews outside Israel responsible for the actions of the Israeli state.
Yeah. And I can think of 2 or 3 occasions in the last few years when I've had to pull people up within our party on that. I think one of the problems I always find around this area is there's a confusion between Jews as a people, as a race, and Judaism as the religion. No, I'm not. I do not follow Judaism. I'm in no way, sense, or shape a religious Jew. But I am a Jew. I am very much a Jew. I feel Jewish. And my Judaism is very important. My Jewish upbringing, my Jewish heritage is important to me. And it's trying to get that distinction, because Judaism as a religion does not go out and grab converts. So to be Jewish, you have to have Jewish parents and grandparents. You cannot be Jewish otherwise.
Oh, you can, but it's just hard work.
It's hard, very hard work, and you have to, and then you have to have a religious conversion to become part of the Jewish people. There are a few others who've managed it in the other way. Anyway, thank you very much. Thanks, George. I see you have to go, but thank you very much. I hope you can catch some of our other things. Claire, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much. A lot of this conversation started around the understanding that the Jewish people had suffered horrendously under the Holocaust, and there's absolutely no denying that. I don't even need to say that, but I am anyway. I think it's important to realize that because we recognize that the pain of that, if you like, we must not allow that to denigrate in any way that the pain of the Palestinians, and we're marking this year, aren't we, the Palestinian 75th anniversary of the start of the Nakba, which is that is a real thing for Palestine, and I think it's only fair that we respect that as well as we respect what happened in history to the Jewish people. And I mean, if any of you would like to comment on that, great. If not, then and we want to move on to the next bit of the conversation, that's fine too. Thank you.
I'll comment on that. I think, yes, we do have to recognise the Nakba. And I wish that the Nakba was explained better in Israel itself. And it should really be explained here in this country, especially in the Jewish schools. Because unless you can understand the other side, you can't have a proper dialogue with them. The same way I think the Holocaust should be being taught in the Palestinian schools on the West Bank, when it isn't. And it's this total not understanding the other side, which is half of the problem. And I think you have to remember that when Herzl had his idea and founded Zionism, it was a reaction to what happened to Dreyfus. And he was one of the journalists covering it, and he realized there was this Jew who was being attacked, being made a scapegoat because he was Jewish. And actually, you'll find there were many Jews who were moving out to Israel even before then. Montefiore, Lord Montefiore, was settling parts of what's now Jerusalem long before Herzl came up with the idea of Zionism or calling it Zionism. There's one of George Eliot's books, and I can't remember which one off the top of my head.
Daniel Deronda.
Daniel Deronda, yes, which has this idea of Jews returning to the land of Israel. And Zionism goes back a long time. But we do have to understand what was happening. And I think the original settlers of the Jewish settlers who came into Israel did try and work with Arabs. They didn't push Arabs out of villages. They bought land, often off of absentee landlords. My grandfather helps found what's now a small town near Netanya called Even Yehuda back in the 1930s. And that was not built on Arab land. It was what happened after the World War II and the Holocaust has to be taught alongside what happened with the Nakba and why Palestinians feel the way they do. But I think both sides have to try and understand the other side much, much more, because unless you can understand what's the drive behind the Palestinians and the Israelis on the other side, you're not going to understand how you can find a compromise that will allow both to live together. And that's part of the reason why I set up this group in the first place. I think the Nakba is very important. We have to try and understand it. We have to try and understand what the drive there is. But some of the things that Abbas has been saying this week, and the fact is that they don't talk about the Holocaust in the Palestinian schools, and they don't talk about the Nakba in the Israeli schools, and they don't try and understand what's happened to the Palestinians. It's just going to create more and more issues. I hope that answered you, Claire.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to add anything to the reading list, I've just recently reread Ilan Pappé's The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, and that just sets out the whole story in a very factual and helpful way. So
Yes, I've read that book.
Anyway,
do you not think, though, and this is obviously a matter for a much wider discussion, but do you not think if you use the phrases like the ethnic cleansing and then associate that with Israel rather than with a certain, if you like, shade of opinion in Israel, do you not think that that in itself is a little bit of a overstatement?
Because I'm quoting the name of a book, The Ethnic Cleansing.
No, I know.
Can you not say the same about our own history, though?
Oh,
yes,
absolutely.
Well, that's so what's the problem? We can admit that various countries.
Lorenzo, you can look at two things. You can look at what happened in 1947 and 48, and you can also look at what happened to the Jews in Arab lands in the end of the 40s and the 50s.
Absolutely, yeah.
In both cases, it was very much how much was people being expelled and pushed off, or how much did people go because they thought that was going to happen to them? And you can't say one or the other. They felt forced to leave. It doesn't matter the details. And what's happening now in the West Bank, where it's ethnic cleansing, what's happening? And while it's not an official government policy, it's very much a semi-official policy, and there are people in the government, and there were people in the last government led by Lapid and Bennett who were very much pushing Arabs off of land, and they are still pushing Arabs off of land within Israel under various pretexts, and it's always the Arab population that has to give up a bit more than the Jewish populations. It could just be where they live. They live in areas that can be used for army training areas, or it could be that they've decided to move Arabs off of those areas. And I think ethnic cleansing actually is a very good term to use, because that is what is happening nowadays.
The historical question, which we're not going to be able to resolve tonight, because it's an issue for historians to debate and argue over, is whether, as Ilan Pappé claims in his book, it was an organized, premeditated plan by the Israeli pre-government, the Yishuv, under Ben-Gurion, to carry that out or not, or whether what happened was what you might call happenstance. And that is a very debated historical sort of hot potato, where there are historians on both sides of the argument. And as somebody who's spent a while looking at that issue in the past, my personal view is that it was more a case of the latter rather than the former. That's very much Benny Morris's view.
Yeah, I think, having been a soldier, having been in situations where people do things and when you look back in the cold light of day, they do very stupid things. But it's the height of battle. It's people have been killed. Some of your friends have been killed, and you act badly. It happens in the British Army as well. It happened. An analogous situation from that same period, what happened in 1947 in India and Pakistan. It's a very similar situation. People were pushed off where they'd lived for decades and centuries, and there was this great big movement of people. These things sadly do happen in that sort of hot war.
I think that's the point I was trying to make, and the point that you've made there, Leon, and that Zachary made, I think, gets to the nub of it. What I was trying to say to Claire was, and I was aware that she was quoting the title of the book, what I meant by that was that in itself is a very controversial and also very broad issue, and you are right. What some people, again, do is they tend to stereotype Israel as though Israel was doing something called ethnic cleansing, rather than, as you rightly say, certain people in certain situations in that area. Exactly like Zachary was saying with British history in, say, India or Pakistan and that period.
And of course, British history in the region itself.
Absolutely. But the point I'm, excuse me, trying to make is that I think sometimes people, again, make these sweeping statements rather than to the depths of writing or reading and debating a book. They make these statements as though something called Israel was doing something called ethnic cleansing. And that's such a sweeping statement that in itself, I think, is way too, extreme a point of view.
To be precise, Lorenzo, though, you have to, whether you think he's actually correct or incorrect, you have to give Ilan Pappé his due. His proposition is that there was a written plan called Plan Dalet.
Yeah, I know.
Precisely that to be done, which a plan that was formulated before the outbreak of any hostilities. Now, it's a historical question as to whether he's right or wrong. And I said, I lean towards supporting those historians who think he's wrong.
So do I. That's right. Yeah. But I understand what you're saying totally.
Yeah. And has anybody else got anything to ask or to add?
Just to say, I think I get what you're trying to sort of get at, Lorenzo. Like some people they call out those things to say that to call it like alarmist language. Now, to try and like sort of characterize a state in a certain way, as opposed to sort of like, basically characterize assassinated state as opposed to just sort of separate the state from the action.
Well put, Zach, yes. And they do it with Britain sometimes, don't they? They say things like Britain is a racist entity because we've got some sort of colonial
I think in
right-wing stuff in there.
Yeah, I see what you mean, but I think in some ways we win though if we kind of yield to that and be like, well, you can't go that sort of thing. Well, but if you take it from a certain definition, you say, well, from a mechanical point of view, a definition point of view, well, yes, that could be the way that it was done, and that kind of thing. I can see by definition, if you want to talk about moving an ethnic group from a certain territory by force, then okay, it's mentioned in the Geneva Conventions and so forth from there. But does that say that all that is for that certain state or that certain the whole point you're trying to put across? And that, well, no, it doesn't. I mean, we're not the same country who carried out the Black War in Tasmania, and that just says we're not the same. Israel, not the same country who's done certain things themselves. But you know, obviously
Exactly.
the soul and the character of Israel is you know, it's under threat at the moment.
I think the difference is you're
right.
talking about something that happened 75 years ago. There are still people alive on both sides who were involved. And
Indeed.
it is still very much part of modern history. I mean, yes, obviously, when these things happen, and I think the biggest ethnic cleansing was Stalin moving a lot of the Cossacks out of what's the Ukraine, and the ethnic Germans out of various parts of Poland and wherever who all disappeared very quickly.
Or even the Armenians, I guess. I'm not sure
the
the figures were on
Armenians,
that, but then like just the whole like,
Bosnia, it keeps happening.
It does keep happening. But I think going back to the point is, I think we can't rewrite history. What we can do is change the future. And I think we have to try and make sure anti-Semitism is attacks on Jews as Jews. And Israel is a Jewish land, a Jewish homeland, but the government of Israel is not all Jews. And I think when you start attacking the Israel and not the Israeli government, then I think that for me is the when you cross over the line between legitimate criticism of Israel and being anti-Semitic, and especially when you start saying Jews have done this.
Yes.
As famously one of our former MPs did.
Yes.
Aren't you basically playing into Netanyahu's hands when you do that too? When you sort of conflate, like, you know, Israel being Jewish, because obviously there's always been that tension between the democracy and the Jewishness sort of thing, and the, you know, Netanyahu would have it so they're like, you know, it's one of the same sort of thing. The Jewish always becomes before the democracy, and a certain definition of being Jewish.
Netanyahu is a master at playing political games around this, and he's actually possibly, I hate to say this, but I think he's actually causing some of the anti-Semitism. And I don't think he did it on purpose, because he doesn't think that far ahead, but he causes some of the anti-Semitic happenings because of the way he tries to define Zionism and Judaism as to be what Netanyahu is doing now in Israel.
Absolutely right.
Well, it's still using the chaos as a ladder sort of thing, isn't it? It's the old populist right-wing thing. Yeah.
Absolutely.
What the right wing or particularly nationalist oriented strand of opinion never realizes that they always play into the hands of the very opposite, more so than the opposite do. I mean, you see that with right wingers in America. You know, if ever anybody wants to get anti-American, I say this, you know, married to an American family, you know, so anti-Americanism is always on the increase when you've got extremely right-wing American governments that wrap themselves in their definition of being American. When you've got a more liberal-minded or centrist sort of leader, this thing never kicks off. Israel was a very popular country when Topol was singing songs about Israel in the 1980s and presenting television programs on the BBC. You had moderate to progressive Israeli governments, and you still had all the horrible conflicts that you have now. But the difference was people knew that the decent people, the moderate people, the open-minded people were the guys in charge, and the extremes were the terrorists on the periphery of both sides. But now it's all got mixed up, and Netanyahu's done more damage to the cause of the Jewish people and particularly the Israeli state, I think, than any leader in modern history. It's just terrible.
Well, that's part of the piece of the puzzle, isn't it? The moderates to the left in Israel, where are they? It's downhill spiral for them, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's a whole other discussion for the day. You know.
There's another discussion I'm having elsewhere.
Can I just say one thing before we conclude, or before we even go near concluding? One of the things Amin was doing in his talk was obviously trying to differentiate, and the Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition does this, differentiate between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Obviously, because of our grouping, we're concerned about the Middle East. We've concentrated more on the anti-Zionism and where that becomes anti-Semitism. But one thing I think we must be aware as liberals, and as, I don't mean liberal Democrats, I mean as liberal-minded people, is that we must let people know that anti-Semitic attacks and anti-Semitism, that whether it's got any basis in anti-Zionism or not, is on the increase. It is a fact.
Oh yes,
Statistically, and it's a horrendous development in the last few
and
years.
sadly, so is anti-Islamic feeling.
Absolutely,
Islamophobia is also
correctly
rising.
right. Yes, it's very, very awful, and
I think
what,
it's part of the fact that the country is now less tolerant, I think, in many ways. But it's not just this country; it's happening elsewhere.
not just this country. That's right.
I think some of the things you see happening in France, where they're banning the I can't remember what.
Oh, the full sort of dress. I forget what's
no,
called.
not
The,
just that. They're banning people. What?
They're banning the hijab as
Yeah,
well.
Dubai, yeah. Banning people so that. And for me, I mean, I say, look, if somebody wants to wear clothing, let them wear it.
Exactly.
If I want to wear a kippah, I should be able to wear it. If somebody wants to wear, if a Sikh wants to wear a turban, they should wear it. And if a Muslim wants to wear some sort of covering,
it's typical sort of French sort of like liberal policy. It's like you're equal now, be happy. You know, it's like
France's failure on integration is something I've also written about. The real issue is that laïcité is a very peculiar French obsession, and they use the word laïcité as if it was exactly the same as secularism, and it's not, because the United States is a secular society. France says that it's a secular society. The United States president will regularly host things like seders and iftars. It's inconceivable that the French president ever could. The United States is comfortable with people having religious views and living by them. France is not, because French laïcité was established in direct opposition to centuries of Roman Catholic Church tyranny. It's got a very different religious history from the religious history of America, or for that matter, the religious history of the UK. And the French state believes that there's only one way of being a French person, and that is a fundamental problem.
You make a very good point, and I have to add to just if I could wear my pro or interest in America hat, the fact is that again, what I said earlier, the conservative extremists now in certain states, by banning X, Y, and Z, are playing into the hands of this anti-Americanism, because Americanism used to be liberty, and that they would go to their death to defend someone's right to wear the kippah, as Leon said, or to wear a hijab. Now you've got people taking such an anti-trans view that they're banning drag shows in certain state areas of Florida, and it's getting that bad. And they're banning things, banning this, banning that, banning the other, and it's completely. And if Reagan was around today, he would be appalled at that. Moderate centre-right people in America find this development odious.